Hey guys, it's me, Kim. So go ahead and strap in. This is going to be a lengthy video, but that's okay because we're gonna learn today. So we're a couple of weeks away from midterm elections in the United States, and I've done a couple of videos in the past about voting and political coalitions. In a comment under one of those videos, one of y'all suggested I read a book by Carol Anderson called One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Democracy. So I decided to go ahead and read it because I like to learn, and it was great. It was so great that I'm making a video about it. Carol Anderson is a historian. She's a tenured professor at Emory University in Atlanta. She's also chair of the African American Studies department there. So I know that she was an award-winning author. I trusted her credentials, so I went into reading this book knowing that if she says it, I believe it. In case you didn't know, and I don't know how you couldn't, Democrats have been losing pretty badly all across the country for about a decade. At this point, 33 of the 50 governors are Republicans. 56% of state legislators are Republicans. Of course, we have a Republican president as well as Republican majorities in Congress. It's not a good look if you're a progressive. We can and should ask ourselves why that is. Are the candidates bad? Is the messaging bad? Yeah, probably. In a lot of cases, yeah. But we cannot have a conversation about Republican majorities all across the United States without having a conversation about voter suppression. Voter suppression describes the way that Republicans are trying to strip people of color in this country of the vote. Now, why are they trying to do that? Because the demographics of the United States of America are changing, and they will not be able to win without cheating. In 1992, non-white voters made up 12% of the electorate. In 2016, it was 31%. Now, of course, the electorate is eligible voters and not the people who actually turn out to vote. That's another conversation. But the point is, if the United States had compulsory voting, a law where every single person had to cast a ballot, this country would be pretty blue. Now, before we dive into it, I have to say, again, this is not my work. This is Carol Anderson's work. So I highly encourage you to read the book. It's a quick read. It was very easy to understand. It was so real. It was too real. But that's what we need. Here she is talking about it.
How bad and how big do you believe voter suppression actually is?
I think it is massive. We have had millions of people blocked from voting. We have had millions purged from the rolls who had been on the voter rolls. The purging and the voter suppression has been so intense that we have Donald Trump in the White House right now. That's the power of voter suppression.
And the legislators are quite crafty. Anderson writes, they target the socioeconomic characteristics of a people: poverty, lack of mobility, illiteracy, etc., and then soak the new laws in racially neutral justifications such as administrative efficiency or fiscal responsibility to cover the discriminatory intent. In this book, Anderson outlines the many pillars of voter suppression: gutting the Voting Rights Act and enacting voter ID laws and these registration laws, purging voter rolls, and gerrymandering. Girl, it's a whole lot, so let's try to get through it as quickly as possible. Slavery was abolished in this country in 1865. After that happened, Black Americans had a few good years, relatively speaking, and like real relatively, where they were able to vote and even elected Black representatives to Congress. Rights for the formerly enslaved were enshrined in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. By the way, the 15th Amendment is the one that guarantees the right to vote. Sounds great. It was all good for a minute, or kind of good, a little good, maybe good. But then white folks decided to come back together and negotiate amongst themselves to strip Black people of political power. There were things across the South where the majority of Black people lived, and still live by the way, that basically made it impossible for Black people to vote by instituting things like poll tests and literacy tests and character tests. Now, Anderson already told us that these laws use race-neutral language with obviously racist intent. In the book, she quotes Virginia Representative Carter Glass, who went on to become Secretary of the Treasury under Woodrow Wilson. Carter Glass said that these laws were adopted with a quote, a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of legally without materially impairing the numerical strength of the white electorate. Now, of course, I don't have the time to get into poll taxes and literacy tests and all that, but there's a lot of great information about that stuff in this book. Again, read it. But the long and short of it is, Black people in this country did not have the legally protected right to vote until Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 1965. How old are your parents? Mine are older than the legally protected right to vote for Black people in the United States. So we get this Voting Rights Act of 1965. It is a good thing. Shout out to the generations of activists who gave up their time and potentially their lives to see this thing passed. Shout out to LBJ for signing it, even though we know he was racist, but he was a racist who did use his political capital to get this really important piece of legislation signed. He acknowledged at the time that signing it was going to make the South lose the Democratic Party.
There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country. There is no issue of states' rights or national rights. There is only the struggle for human rights.
But basically, the VRA made illegal poll taxes and literacy tests and all of that other BS that kept Black people away from the polls. It also instituted a provision where Southern states could not make any changes to their voting laws without federal permission. Now, of course, this legislation was not perfect, it never is, but Anderson notes that in the 4 or so years after it was passed, over 1 million Black people were registered to vote. Now, just a side note, this is one of the reasons why a lot of Black people put our faith in the federal government, because states' rights usually mean the right to discriminate. Oh, and like I mentioned before, at this time, the South was solidly Democratic. LBJ knew that. He knew he was going to alienate Southern Democrats. And this was the time when Southern Democrats abandoned the Democratic Party. Now, I'm sure it's just a coincidence that the people who were so incensed by the idea that Black people might finally be able to exercise their federally guaranteed right to vote suddenly abandoned the Democratic Party after a Democratic president signed the law. Across the South, there was immediate pushback to the Voting Rights Act, including the idea of preclearance, which is what I was talking about earlier, where if a Southern state wanted to change a voting law, they had to get permission from the federal government. There was so much pushback, in fact, that organizers and activists became targets. They were prosecuted for registering people to vote. And our current Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, actually prosecuted organizers who helped old people fill out absentee ballots. Anyways, the South, not happy. They challenged the VRA repeatedly, but the law remains intact until a Supreme Court decision comes down, Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, which strikes down preclearance. Now the South can make any voting law at once without getting any permission from the federal government. Now, that was the Voting Rights Act story. Now we have to get into the voter ID story. So Anderson also talks about after 2000, that crazy election that George W. Bush won by 537 votes that was actually decided by the Supreme Court. George W. Bush becomes president, but at the same time, there's all these conversations about voter fraud. And of course, this turns out to be not true. It's fake news. Anderson notes in the book that when there were audits of millions of voter records, only like a handful of irregularities were found. That is not an epidemic. After the ridiculous election of 2000, there's like a push to make sure that people do not completely lose faith in our electoral systems. good luck with that. So in 2002, there's this Help America Vote Act passed. Now, one thing that snuck into the Help America Vote Act was this provision that citizens would have to provide ID before voting. Now, the types of ID and the ranges of ID were supposed to be really inclusive. Of course, that's not what happened. That law also says that voters can only be removed from rolls for a handful of reasons, including death, name change, felony conviction, and you have to be notified before you're removed. But there's a problem. This fraud narrative takes hold of the Republican Party, and then they're able to erect barriers for people who want to get an ID. It's difficult for working class people, poor people, old people, students to get the documents together to get IDs. But it's also more difficult for Black people, for example, to even get to the DMV to get a photo identification. For example, take Georgia, where 17.7% of Black households don't have access to a car compared to 4.4% of white households. So how are you gonna get to the DMV to get a driver's license when you don't drive? You don't have a car. And we have to note that this is not just a Southern phenomenon. It's happening pretty much anywhere where there are concentrations of Black people. So let's take Wisconsin, for example, that has a Black enclave in Milwaukee. So in 2011, they passed this law that says that the acceptable forms of voter ID are passport or driver's license. Now, they said that while shutting down the DMVs in the blackest parts of the city, cutting those hours and making it nearly impossible, particularly for people who work regular jobs, to obtain that identification. There's huge bias in the documents that are even accepted as valid forms of ID. For example, in Alabama, you can use a gun license or a driver's license, but you can't use the identification card that you receive if you live in government housing. And in Alabama, 31 driver's license offices were closed, and the ones that remain are open for only a few hours a day or a week, and they are difficult to get to. Some people have to drive 50 miles to get there. This actually isn't in the book, but it relates because I just read an article about how in North Dakota, Native Americans have to have a street address on their voter ID.
It is a very complicated problem because some reservations, they don't have street addresses. Majority of them don't have house numbers. So what they've been utilizing is a P.O. box.
Margaret Landon, a Native American voting rights advocate, says just weeks before November's election, some Native Americans, her husband included, are scrambling to get new IDs just to vote.
The suppressive effects of this law are real. Turnout gaps are higher in states with these voter ID laws. Now, if you're fortunate enough to even be able to obtain an ID, Republicans across this country are making it even harder to cast a ballot if you're poor or Black or immigrant, basically anybody who might vote Democratic. In Ohio, for example, Republicans eliminated polling places in areas where Black people live. And across the South, 868 polling places have been removed in areas that were previously covered by that pre-clearance provision. With fewer polling places and not enough poll workers, that means that if you live in a Black area, you could be waiting 4 and 5 hours to vote. Now, this is a trend across the country. Early voting hours and dates are being slashed because Black people, working class people, are more likely to cast a ballot on those days. Why? Because it is more difficult if you have job insecurity to take time off on a weekday to go vote. Oh, and in North Carolina, not only are they slashing voting hours and early voting hours, but they are moving polling sites, creating confusion, and making people drive 20, 30 miles out of the way. In Florida, another swing state, the 10 districts with the longest voting wait times are 70% Black. So there's that foolishness. Now let's move on to the voter roll purges, or what they like to call voter roll maintenance. If there's any gap in your voting history, say you voted in 2008 but not in 2010 or 2012, states like Georgia are using that as an excuse to kick you off of the voter rolls. And then there are these programs like Exact Match, which are supposed to match DMV records with voter records, and the matches have to be exact. So if a hyphen is misplaced, if there's a typo, if your name is misspelled, you're gone. 2/3 of the people whose voter registrations were canceled between 2013 and 2016 in the state of Georgia were Black. And then there's this cross-check system, which is supposed to be kind of like a nationalized database that's supposed to make sure that people aren't voting in multiple places. Now, the problem is, and I had no clue about this before I read this book, but non-white people are more likely to share the same last name. That means that there's more likelihood for mix-ups. Anderson says people of color are overrepresented in 85 of the top 100 most popular last names in the United States. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of Washingtons and Jacksons and Jenkins. My last name is quite popular, so I believe it. And Anderson also points out that felony disenfranchisement steals millions of Black votes across the country. 1 in 13 Black people in the United States cannot vote because they've been convicted of a felony. And in Florida, of course, it's particularly bad. 1 in 3 felons who cannot vote in that state are Black, and it ends up being 1 in 5 Black people in that state who are disenfranchised. Now, finally, Anderson talks about gerrymandering. Every 10 years, state legislatures get to redraw congressional districts. That's why 2020 is gonna be a big deal, just saying. And after that red wave of 2010 that we talked about earlier, Republicans redrew congressional boundaries to make sure that Black votes are just not effective. They created more GOP districts that are not competitive. It's at the point now where they're getting many more seats than their proportion of the vote. But the Supreme Court has said that's fine. Partisan gerrymandering, which is optimizing the district so that your party will win, is apparently constitutional, and it's a problem. Here's an example Anderson gives. In Georgia, when 2 Republican incumbents barely won re-election in 2016 because their platforms did not resonate with the growing African-American population in the Atlanta suburbs, the GOP-controlled legislature simply redrew their districts, moving the Black neighborhoods over to a Democrat and extracting their white constituents to Republican districts. Another place to look at is Texas, where whites make up 45% of the population, but they control 70% of the congressional districts. And it's particularly bad in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where whites make up 20% of the population, but control 80% of the congressional districts. Gerrymandering is bad because it insulates representatives from the will of their constituents. This is a deeply divided country. I mean, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote only by a couple of percentage points. If your district is not competitive, then you have no incentive to listen to people who are across the aisle from you. The only people you really have to listen to are the people who show up on the fringe, because it's those people who can drop in and be big and flashy and extreme and pull your district further to the margins. That is what we are seeing in the Trump era. The right-wing crazies have so much power. Not to mention that gerrymandering depresses turnout, because if you feel like your vote doesn't matter or your district isn't competitive, why vote? In 2016, 97% of incumbents were re-elected to the House. Oh girl, that was a lot. I say this not to make you feel depressed or anxious, even though that's how it made me feel after I read this book, but I said it to underscore the fact that if you have the opportunity to vote in a couple of weeks, then you should take it. Because the only way any of this stuff is going to change is by changing the people who are in charge. That's it. And frankly, I'm motivated by the fact that the people who do not have my best interest at heart do not want me to show up. So shout out to Dr. Carol Anderson once again. The book One Person, No Vote was an incredible history, super informative, very depressing, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. She makes sure to highlight the resistance to all of this stuff that's happening. Shout out to the Get Out the Vote efforts all across this country. Y'all are appreciated. It's not just presidential elections that matter. The elections closer to home, state, local, are just as important, if not more important, for your life. So please, November 6th, let's be out. Well guys, we made it together. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you appreciated the work that went into this, the work that we do here, become a patron on our Patreon. There's a lot of cool stuff over there. Or make a one-time donation, you know, whatever you want to do. Links are below. Sign up for the email newsletter, grab some merch, leave me a comment, tell me what you want to hear from me. Don't be rude, because I'll block you. That's all I got. Thanks, guys. Bye.